Hello and welcome to Brave New Us. I'm here today with women's health and napro specialist, Dr. Susan Caldwell. Dr. Caldwell, welcome to Brave New Us.
Hi, Samantha. Great to meet you and see you and be with your audience today.
Thank you so much for being here. Can we start by having you describe your experience with IVF and share your journey to where you are now?
Yes, I'd love that. So it started. I'm currently 51, so it's a little bit back in my history. It was 1999 when I went through IVF. So at this point in my life, I had just stopped taking birth control for about 10 years in order to avoid pregnancy and also to go through med school and kind of achieve all the things that I thought I needed to achieve. And I thought the birth control pill would help with that. And because I had terrible periods and some, for a lot of reasons why I went on it. So anyway, so I got off birth control after 10 years and then somehow magically thought that I would just get pregnant in that 1 month, like so many women do, right? And I started kind of tracking my cycle with a natural for a family planning system, and things were looking strange. So just so you know, as I was kind of considering my options, I was very immature. I had poor understanding of expectations and what fertility really meant, that fertility was health. And so I was just in a really, immature spot. And I got frustrated quickly when I didn't get pregnant, like in 2 months. And so I had a friend who worked at the IVF clinic, and she said, "Hey, why don't you come meet one of our doctors? I'm sure they could help you." So I met with them, and they quickly offered um, IUI, which is an insemination process. We did that. It didn't work. And again, just back to my immaturity, I was very impatient, and I had this little window that I wanted to get pregnant because I was finishing med school and I was going into residency and I had my timeline, right? And so this is so many women. I know this is a story of so many women that I've seen. So I'm kind of laughing, but just being honest with where so many women are. And they feel like we have to do this. This is life or death, timeline. So the doctor there did a kind of a cursory evaluation. He did some ultrasounds and some basic labs, and even did a laparoscopy looking for endometriosis because of my bad periods. And sure enough, I did have endometriosis. Mm-hmm. So he did treat that surgically. But then again, a couple more cycles went by and there was no pregnancy. And again, I was still impatient. I had my timeline. And he said, "Well, we could do IVF." Mm-hmm. So there I went. It was a perfect door was open. I thought, okay, let's do this. We're going to take care of this. But it really didn't turn out that great because of the medicine, the high dose of medicine they gave me. I think he overestimated what I needed. In other words, IVF is not a personalized approach, right? It's kind of a one size fits all. And the medicines they gave me were very, very strong, too strong for my body. We ended up having somewhere between 20 and 30 embryos, which is a lot. It's a lot. And we transferred 3, which is a lot. And he said we would have less than a 5% chance of having triplets. And probably, based on some numbers, he said, we don't have I think that's why he put in 3, because he really didn't think that any would take. And sure enough, I ended up with a triplet pregnancy and ovarian hyperstimulation, which is this kind of semi-rare side effect where the ovaries, because of all the medicines that were given to ovulate, the ovaries continue to kind of spill fluid into the abdomen in response to all of the drugs that happen, especially when there's a pregnancy, because when there's a pregnancy and HCG is being made, the follicles are now the corpus luteum, and that those cysts are continuing to try to work and function. And sometimes a lot of fluid is poured out. So I had severe dehydration, vomiting, abdominal pain. I had to be admitted into the hospital. I had very critical lab values. I really felt like I was dying. Personally, it was a terrible situation. Then found out we had a triplet pregnancy. Then at 9 weeks, one of the babies died because of excess blood beneath the sac, beneath the where the baby was. And then the other two babies also had that same sac of blood called a subchorionic hemorrhage. So there I was, feeling helpless, feeling sick, and being told that I could lose all of 3 babies at that time. So that turned the pregnancy into a very high risk pregnancy. I was on bed rest the entire time.
Oh my goodness.
Ended up delivering twins at 36 weeks. But again, that was even a complex pregnancy. One was delivered vaginally, one C-section. I had complications. Wow. My wound opened. I had a blocked intestine called an ileus. I had to have a NG tube into my nose, into my stomach. Anyway, I could go on and on. It was a mess, and it was just not necessary, and so then my daughter, well, she's now 19, but so my twins were boys, and my daughter, and so 5 embryos were frozen for 4 years, and then after 4 years, we went to do an embryo transfer with the 5 embryos. Only 2 survived the defrosting, and then 2 embryos went into the womb, and then my daughter was born. Yeah.
And now at this point, looking back, you say, I have children thanks to IVF, but I wouldn't recommend it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I strongly believe, now that I've been doing this work for so long, over 10 years, that the vast majority of women who begin the IVF process don't need it. And it's because I believe, I'm going to say this is probably, a bold statement, but I think IVF is a predatory practice. It's a predatory business practice. And it preys on women who are afraid and who don't have, they don't know that there's an option to really get help and to get healthy, instead of turning to IVF, which can be very, like in my case, I have a classroom full of children that died because of my choices, my decisions. And I haven't mentioned my husband at the time. We are now unfortunately divorced and annulled. So it was a very unhealthy marriage. And so that was painful as well. There was a lot of pain, so much of it was just a lot of pain. So I just look back, wow, like at what cost? At what cost? Children are beautiful, children are a gift, but they are not to be demanded and grasped at, right? They're gifts to be received. And so I've learned a lot. And so because of my own experience and the experience of so many women, I just don't recommend it, because I think there's more harm done than good. And it feeds into a lot of really unhealthy kind of emotions, like fear and then impatience and things like that. So it's just, I don't think it's good for people.
Was there a moment or one specific experience, or maybe a trajectory of experiences that led you to shift? Because that's a pretty dramatic shift of perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think as I was going through it, I thought to myself, this is really, like, what have I gotten myself into? you know.
Mm.
I just remember thinking that, like, oh my gosh, I didn't ask for this. Like, I just wanted a baby. Like, I didn't ask for all of this. And so that was one of them. That was very, of course, I just loved my babies. I loved being a mom. So that was just an early, like, little flicker of like, I wonder if there could have been a different way,
Mm.
you know? And then once I learned about napro through a couple of friends who had been through the process of surgery, and they explained how, they weren't just kind of rushed through I shouldn't say rushed, but like they were evaluated in a very personal way,
Mm.
individualized way, and they had had a thorough evaluation, and it sounded just like so much more caring and loving and personalized than I had. I thought, wow, I was just shocked. Now, this was about maybe 10 years after my IVF that I learned about this. And so the thought that, you know, infertility could be approached in a more gentle, dignified way was just, it was breathtaking and eye opening and delightful to me. So once I learned that, then I thought, why would anybody, have IVF? Knowing, of course, I understood because I had chosen it, but knowing what I do now, why would I ever choose that?
Mm-hmm. And now, throughout all of this time, where were you in your faith journey when you were doing IVF,
Mm,
and then when you were changing your perspective to where you are today? How has that changed?
yes. Oh, that made a huge difference. So I grew up in a Catholic home, received my sacraments at a normal age. After confirmation, my family kind of practiced the faith sporadically. There was no real practice of the faith in my home. Um, as I was going through this journey, no one in my family or my friends like asked me, is this the right thing to do? Like, the church doesn't, condone this, or, no one really gave me a reason to pause and think about it. And again, that was 1999. They thought, oh, this is great. This is medical technology that's going to help. This is wonderful. So then the friends that I mentioned, the NAPRO patients, friends that I mentioned who had been through the Pope Paul VI Institute and had surgery, I met them at a woman's, like a mom's group at church. So I had gotten to a point right before this meeting of these women where I just had kind of reached the end of my life. How can I say this? My own, I reached the end of my self sufficiency, I guess you could say, right? So I had kind of achieved all the things that life told me I needed to be happy. A marriage, children, a nice house, a nice career, plenty of vacations, clothes, purses, whatever, like the list, right, of all the things that life gives you and we all seek. And I just remember having this intense sense of like, is this it? Is this it? I didn't feel like I was a really good wife, a good mom, a good doctor. Just didn't feel like I was really who I was meant to be. And so I thought, well, I'm Catholic and I've kind of been putting God in the back seat for a long time. And so maybe I need to draw closer to him and see if he has a different way. So in that prayer group, we were introduced to the teachings of the church around marriage, fertility, sexuality, through a study by Jeanette Benkovic
Okay.
called Full of Grace or Women of Grace or something. And it was so eye-opening that, this whole idea of like my misery, right? And my grasping at all of these things in life that I thought would make me happy, good things, right? None of that was bad, but it was the way, right? The way that I was going about it all on my own, right? Trying to create all of this happiness for myself instead of following the path that the church has beautifully laid out for us, in order for us to flourish and become who God created us to be. So I started learning theology of the body. I started just learning all the lights started to come on in the room. Just started in my heart, in my brain. And it all made sense why I was in so much pain, why I felt so empty. And yeah.
So
So
what are the major differences between the IVF approach, which sounds like was
yeah.
more of a high control approach,
Yes. Yes.
versus the napro approach
Mm-hmm.
that you then found?
Mm-hmm. So a few major differences. NAPRO is very person centered, right? It looks at the whole person and the couple. If the focus is on infertility, sometimes NAPRO patients are just women because of their problems, but it really seeks to kind of bring the whole person to health, as opposed to, okay, this thing is a problem to be solved, to be fixed, right? It's there's a big difference there between looking at the person and looking at the problem, right? I'm not a problem, right? um the other thing I think along those same lines is NAPRO truly delivers care, health care, right? Cares for the health of the person. Whereas IVF and contraception and just that whole continuum is really about control and manipulation. Like this, it's almost like this camp of like, this is how we do things. And if you want us to help you, then you're just going to have to kind of get in line and march to our orders, because this is what we do here. So it feels very suppressive and manipulative.
So medically, when you're going in for IVF versus what you would go
Mm-hmm.
through with somebody who's
Mm-hmm.
offering you the NAPRO way,
Mm-hmm.
what would you sit down? What would be the first things that each one would offer you? And then how does that path proceed?
Yes, that's a great question. So in both cases, there would be a meeting where there would be a history taken. Like the patient would explain, like, this is my history, and this is what's happened, and this is my age, and this is, just kind of the information gathering from the patient. But right away, that's where the paths diverge. So in the practice that I'm in now, what I do is I tell the women, okay, women, depending, but I tell them, okay, now we have to gather information for the next 2 months. We need to listen to your body. You need to listen to your body by using a Creighton model system of charting, right? So the woman is now, she's, instead of kind of allowing her body to be kind of bullied and kind of dragged around and manipulated, the woman actually has to turn toward herself and her body. And with a trained instructor, we want to seriously look at what signs and symptoms her body is giving her, clues, if you will, so that we know how this particular woman needs to be helped.
Okay. So what does it mean to think about infertility as a symptom rather than a disease?
Yeah. So, when infertility is a symptom, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? It's not the thing, right? We just know that infertility is often just a clue that a woman's health needs attention, right? It's just a clue. That's all it is. And so when we know that it's just a clue, right? It's not the whole bit of information. It's not everything about the woman. It's just a little clue. It just gives us kind of a way to look deeper and then to find all of the problems, right? There's a much bigger problem going on when infertility is present. And if you don't actually take the time to look at the deeper problem, the bigger problem, then you're just not going to help the woman, honestly.
And you said, you mentioned that NAPRO can also help women who are not experiencing infertility, but who may be having some other gynecological symptoms. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure. So before, for example, I was given IVF, right? I was given birth control, right? So I had really bad periods, terrible cramps, and the doctor just kind of gave me birth control, right? And there we go. That is a symptom. That is a clue that there's an underlying problem with my health and my fertility. So instead of just kind of sweeping the problem under the rug, right? You actually look at it, right? And to be honest, that does take a certain amount of maturity for patients to want to do that. Because to be honest, like I want to believe that there's really nothing wrong with me
Hmm.
in every stage of life, right? Especially when I'm in my 20s and I just want a baby. I don't want you to tell me there's more bad news than I'm just that I have a thyroid problem and I have insulin resistance and I have, other issues. I'm not getting enough sleep and I have gut health problems. Like, to be honest, like, I don't know that a lot of women, want to hear all that bad news. So it is attractive for people who are in denial about their health. Like, no, I just want to go to IVF. I just want to take care of this. I don't want to look. I just want to put the blinders on. I just want to look at a baby. I don't want to look at anything else. So, um, anyway, but the question about women. So before a woman, so if the woman with infertility had been truly paying attention to her symptoms in the past, before that diagnosis of infertility, she wouldn't have infertility.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's ovarian cysts, whether it's irregular periods, heavy periods, migraines around periods, like there's so many problems that women have leading up to when they decide that fertility is a goal, that are just not looked at and just brushed under the rug and just ignored, that by the time they want to have a baby, and like me right now, right, I don't have time to look at all those things. I don't want to look at all those things. It's kind of boring and depressing. I just want to have a baby. So a lot of the time when I'm meeting with these women, there's just a ton of fear and shame around looking at their cycles and looking at the deeper, and I get so excited because, oh, good, we get to look for this and we get to find this. And they're like, yeah, but I don't want anything to be wrong. I can't take this. This is too hard. And so it's a lot. It's
Yeah,
a
that's
lot.
interesting because, well, I had kind of a similar experience. I didn't struggle with infertility, but I had what I now know was endometriosis in high school, or since I was a little kid, and in high school was when I was put on hormonal contraceptives because that was going to be the solution for that. And it wasn't until I was getting ready to be married and learning Creighton, and I realized, my husband and I realized together, oh, there might actually be a solution for this. And that doctor was able to look at my chart, and I had been to so many doctors and I'd been on so many pain medications, and to the point where I couldn't, I was on narcotics and I couldn't function. Not good stuff. But then I was actually able to, in one visit, she said, well, this kind of your chart looks like endometriosis. We can do a surgery. And I was a little intimidated by that, but at the same time, like, so much relief of, there's an answer. You could figure this out and you could solve and help this problem. So
Yes.
I would think there are at least some women who would be, excited to
Oh,
focus
yes.
on kind of like healing those
Yes.
underlying issues rather than just
Yes.
putting a band-aid with contraceptives
Yes.
for whatever it is they're experiencing, because contraceptives have their own
Yes.
side effects.
Yes. Yes. And I guess I'm more talking too about the women who might have already been through IVF
Okay.
or some of those procedures, and then they come to me because that friend told them that I helped them get pregnant, and then I explain to them the work that's involved, and they're just not. It's very stressful to them. So I just want to make sure I want to be honest
Sure.
about, a napro approach is a wonderful approach, but it does kind of demand a little bit of some emotional maturity
Mm-hmm.
to be able to look at it all. Yeah.
Yeah. So thinking about this, I guess the cost and the outcomes of IVF versus napro, how would you compare those two approaches?
When you say costs, you mean?
I mean financial costs.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So napro is really, it only costs what, a normal, medical visit would cost. I mean, it's very minimal, co-pays are included, the drugs are very cheap relative to IVF. Charting, might cost somewhere around, less than $500, I would imagine, within the first 6 months. So probably much less than that, but just trying to give a general overview. Sometimes it's covered by insurance, whereas IVF, I believe now is over $30,000, maybe even more for one cycle. So to me, it's so much, so much better on
Yeah.
so many levels. Yeah.
Right. I've heard IVF described as sort of like a process of hijacking a woman's body with the hormones that you're putting into it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's an accurate description? Does that
Oh,
resonate with your
absolutely.
experience?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I like the word hijacking. I often use hot wiring, you
Mm.
know. Yeah, but you know, it's just not it's just not good for the body to for a woman's body to receive so many hormones and really like force the body the ovaries to ovulate in such a pressured way without kind of supporting the luteal phase. So if you recall, the first part of the cycle is called the follicular phase. That's when the follicle is growing and estrogen levels are rising. But we've got this even more critical phase in my understanding, which is the luteal phase. So in the luteal phase, we're preparing the lining to be healthy and mature and able to support the embryo once there's an implantation. And so I see this all the time, women who have been on birth control for a long time, that lining has not gone through a healthy maturation and development. And so, there's a huge push on the front end to make all of these follicles and eggs become released. But yet, if there is a fertilization and there's not a healthy lining, then there's not going to be a good chance of a successful pregnancy. Like, for example, I see a lot of patients with recurrent miscarriage. And they are recommended often, once they have maybe 2 miscarriages, they're told to go to the IVF clinic.
Yeah. And so what, if you're looking at that as NAPRO perspective, what would be the response? Recurrent miscarriages. What
Oh
are
my
we
goodness. Oh my
what are we
goodness.
looking at?
Yeah, we're missing the boat. I just saw a patient who had 6 consecutive recurrent miscarriages,
Oh my gosh.
and 2 of which one was in the second trimester, 1 or 2 were in the second trimester, and 0 live births. And she was just told to go back to the Fertility Institute. Man, they had tested every gene that her husband and her had. I mean, and she really needed progesterone in pregnancy.
And so
She had a healthy baby. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
just
So
by supplementing with progesterone as soon as she knew she was pregnant, before she
mm-hmm.
was pregnant.
Yeah, and not just supplementing, because she had supplementation before, right? But it is actually supplementing in the way that her body needs to be supplemented. In other words, levels in many cases, well, first of all, anybody with recurrent miscarriage, we've got to find out what their progesterone is in the luteal phase. Like I mentioned, if we don't have a healthy lining and healthy progesterone, not just one day in the luteal phase, but the entire time,
Mm-hmm.
So I see something called a late luteal defect very often. So where women's their corpus luteum, the part of the ovary that's making the hormones and the progesterone, for that lining to be healthy, it kind of stops working after about a week, instead of continuing on for about 2 weeks to make those hormones. So what happens is the lining gets just partially prepared for implantation. And then these patients continue to have maybe an implantation, but recurrent miscarriage, recurrent miscarriage, recurrent miscarriage. This is so easily treated once it's identified with subcutaneous HCG shots given throughout the luteal phase, so that that lining can receive, a baby and support it. And then once pregnancy is confirmed, those progesterone levels are being checked every week to 2 weeks throughout pregnancy. And we give more or less depending on what the blood levels are.
So it sounds like the access to information for a woman about what's going on with her own body before she's trying to conceive, as she conceives, and throughout pregnancy would be much higher, and like you said, more personal. Whereas IVF, would they even know any of those things about why they were struggling with?
No, they don't look. And so if you look at the research that comes out of the different fertility clinics, the number there's a big bucket term that they use called unexplained infertility. And it's well over 25% in these big IVF centers, because they really don't look for things like a type 3 luteal defect. They're not looking for those things, because the focus is on giving these big drugs in their mind. I think, of course, I've never worked there, but just from my experience and seeing what they're giving my patients, their focus is on, let's force the ovaries to ovulate. Mm-hmm. And then they give progesterone in the luteal phase, but they don't measure. They just kind of give everybody the standard dose. Mm. Like in my case, they gave me progesterone once they found out I was pregnant, and then at 12 weeks, they said, "Oh, you don't need it anymore." And they never tested it or measured it, just protocol.
That's interesting, because hormones are such a tricky thing. Even just the slightest level being off. I also have thyroid condition, and just the slightest level being off can have a huge impact on your whole life, like across the board with different symptoms. So that's interesting. They don't even measure to see that it would be a standard dose.
Yeah. It's just one size fits all,
So do you know the difference in terms of outcomes for pregnancy and for live births? Do you know any difference between success rates for IVF?
Wow. No, I don't know that I
think the last time that I looked it up, it was maybe 30% success rate for live birth in IVF and 80% for napro.
Oh, really?
But
wow.
Which would be very
that makes sense.
Yeah. But that was a few years ago. So I was wondering if there was any update.
That makes sense. And the kind of the problem, there's not a problem with napro, but the problem with getting the numbers for napro is that, there's not enough of us that have boots on the ground doing this work. And I don't have time to do research. I've got too many patients, but I'll tell you, this is not a very financially rewarding, efficient way to practice medicine, right? So I would not be doing this if it was for the money I'm getting or for the financial reward or for any other reason. It's because it is so beautiful and beneficial, and the results are so great that to not do it, I feel like I would be, not, I don't know. I just can't not do it, because it needs to be done. You know what I mean? It's too beautiful. Yeah. It's just too beautiful.
You're saying that that big pharma and big fertility are making a lot of money off of this when they're putting women through procedures that they probably don't need to have?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
I
That's
think the latest
exactly what I'm
study
saying.
that I saw said that 20%, might be a little off there, but it's about right. 20% of women who have gone through IVF go on to conceive naturally afterwards
Mm-hmm.
without any further
Oh, yes.
treatments.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. You know, I think that's just, there's so much to say about that. But um, one way to think of it too is that once a woman has a baby and goes through that whole process of a term delivery, at that point, you know, her brain, the organs in her brain that control the reproductive system and the ovaries are kind of now in sync finally. Like she's finally grown up from a reproductive standpoint, you know. So finally her brain knows what to do with the ovaries, and the ovaries know how to control the uterus, and the uterus, you know, I mean, it's just, it's finally, the whole system is kind of moving and grooving finally. And so therefore it's going to be easier, no matter whether she gets pregnant through IVF or through another way. When she's healthy enough to have a baby, she's probably going to be able to have another one as well, as long as her needs are being met and her health conditions are being addressed. Yeah.
So some of these high-powered companies, tech companies, they're offering egg freezing as a benefit to young women who want to delay childbearing to focus on their careers. On the flip side of that, there are some less financially stable young women who are being enticed to become egg donors in exchange for
Yes.
monetary compensation, or some clinics even encourage them to forego that compensation or just to use that compensation to freeze their own eggs as well as a backup, you know, so they give some and keep some so that they have a backup in case they struggle with future infertility. What would you say to a young woman who is in either of these positions, considering donating or freezing her own eggs?
Again, I just believe the woman is seeing herself and seeing herself kind of as an object, allowing herself to be treated as an object, right? And that is what happens to every woman who gets on birth control and goes through IVF. It's just the way that we see ourselves, and the doctors, just like we just put, you know, we give this control over to the doctors out of fear. I mean, there's just so many bad things happening through these transactional agreements. And I just, again, I'm going to use the word, I know it's a strong word, but this is predatory behavior on these companies. I mean, these companies are doing it for themselves. You know, I think to keep these women working, the companies whose employees want to freeze their eggs for later so they can keep, you know, producing for the company and not be bothered by pregnancy at the time. So I just think that we need to listen. You know, every single one of us has a little voice inside that tries to tell us when our dignity is being violated, you know. And I would just say to those women, you know, how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel honored and valued? Or does it make you feel a little bit used and exploited on either one of those sides? And I just want to mention this too, that we're talking about creating a new life, right? And one of the eye-opening moments I had along my journey was when I read from the church's document Donum Vitae that, you know, there's no such thing as a right to have a child. A child, on the other hand, holds the right to be the fruit of an act of conjugal love between its parents. And it has the right to be respected as a person from the moment of conception. So, and the mother has a particular duty and right to see herself, you know, not as an object, right? But kind of this this beautiful home where life might begin for this other person. And so I do believe that we as women have a particular sense of the sacred and of dignity. And I think we need to be encouraged to listen to that place in us that says, you know, something feels off here. Something feels off here. And to question that, and just to put some space between that fear or that desire for a child, and to pause and seek some counsel if it's possible.
That's so interesting, that quotation that you read from Don Vitae, because I agree that we don't have a right to a child, but I'm pretty sure what we're witnessing in our culture is that most people believe we do have a right to a child, and they act as though, or our culture acts as though, the child really doesn't have a right to much of anything. Doesn't have a right to life, let alone a right to be conceived as a fruit of conjugal love by married parents who love each other. That doesn't seem to be a part of our cultural consciousness at all.
Right. Yeah. And when I read that for the first time, to be honest, I mean, it was hard to read, like as an examination of conscience, right? And so it was hard. But then, you know, again, we all have to look at, you know, kind of our own stories of, you know, if a woman is in that place where she feels like she wants to sell her eggs as a commodity, or, you know, all these things are such tricky places. Like, what happened to her in her life? Who hurt her? That she feels like this is what she has to do, right? So we've all been deeply wounded by these kinds of lines of thought. Just yeah, the idea that a person is an object. We've all been hurt by this.
How did you respond when you read that? Because if I can imagine, a lot of people, when they read something that the church has said, or that somebody says the church has said, and they feel, I mean, we should all feel personally implicated in one way or another by something Jesus has said. But how did you? I can imagine that would turn them away or turn them off. I think it does that for a lot of people, but clearly that wasn't the case for you. What were you thinking, and how did you respond in a way that didn't turn you away?
Right. Well, I think at the same time as that I was seeing this, I was deeply immersed in the teaching of theology of the body. And then, so understanding that every mistake and sin that I've committed is only a drop in the ocean of God's mercy. And in fact, we are all like literally doomed, you know, in the grip of the enemy in this world. And so just to see that I don't have to save myself. I can admit that I'm a flawed, pitiful, broken, sinful creature. In fact, the more that I admit that, the more right I have to God's mercy, which is the only thing that saves us. So I think I was just, I had enough understanding of the mercy of God as I was reading this. But to be honest, like it did hurt. In fact, I remember sitting in the classroom when we had the 2 hour, you know, course on the teaching on IVF, and they were taking us through, you know, what the procedure looks like, and I was, you know, kind of having some PTSD, some flashbacks about, you know, just being honest about how wounding that was, and how I did feel like an object, and how I, you know, I made decisions that caused my children to be thrown in the garbage, you know, like going through all that, like, wow, you know, and I'm as we're learning this, you know, we're having daily mass, and, you know, we have, it was just beautiful. It was beautiful. I don't know, honestly, without that kind of a setting, I just felt like I was kind of in a womb, you know, when I was there. I was just safe and I was protected, and it was just a place for me to grow and to learn. and also to recognize, like, I've got to, I got to look at this, I've got to look at this. And then I was also in a place where I was making a choice to kind of help women to not have to go through this, to be at kind of at risk, to be exploited in this way. And that was very hopeful.
Right. So in thinking about those embryos that you lost through the process, and realizing there may be parents listening who have used IVF and are waking up to the reality of their own embryos being lost or in stasis, what was the experience like? And what would you say to those men and women?
Yeah. So, gosh, I fortunately didn't have to deal with the idea of my embryos being forever in a freezer. I have patients, I've talked to people who have this kind of reality where they can't have any more children for whatever reason, and they've got to make big decisions about their embryos. That was not my case. I felt like we had closure at the end of my case, but man, like, we have to seek good counsel. If you're in that situation, there's so many resources. If you're, even if you're not Catholic, the NCBC, the National Catholic Bioethics Center, is a great place to call. Even the Pope Paul VI Institute has a wonderful sister there, a nun who is an ethicist, and they are very happy to talk to anyone who calls and has questions about that. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sacred Heart Guardians.
No, not familiar.
It's a Catholic group that its mission is to provide a sacred burial for embryos. So if the parents want to provide a dignified funeral for their babies, I believe they have a particular process to go through to give these babies, these frozen embryos, a proper, dignified funeral, which is beautiful.
I had not heard of that. I'll definitely be looking them up after this. And so I think now, the last I read, were over 1 million frozen embryos that are left over. They could be thawed and discarded. They could be used for research. And then there's also a process. Some people call it embryo donation. Some people call it embryo adoption. And that's when families use IVF to put an existing embryo and that they raise as their own child. Some Christian ethicists remark that this is praiseworthy. This is a great idea. The word from the Vatican officially says this is a situation of injustice that cannot be resolved because of the cooperation with the evil of IVF. It's kind of a gray area until the magisterium is a little bit more definitive. What advice would you give as a mother, physician, to women and couples who are considering sort of this form of prenatal adoption?
Yeah, because this is an emotionally charged, very difficult place to be in, right? A deep desire for a child, a deep desire to complete their family. There's probably a lot of fear and just a lot of emotion. And so that's so important that one would pray and seek wise counsel from those places that I just listed. That's so incredibly important. I don't think, because of what you just said, I don't think any of us can tell them what to do. Right? I mean, this is where their consciences have to be formed. They have to have a spirit of discernment, have some wise people helping them, praying with them, guiding them. And finally, they have to listen to their conscience about it, because who knows, they could really be called to enter into this, but then they just have to be, warned that, in my case, 4 years, my my embryos were frozen, 5 embryos and only 1 survived.
Mm.
So I think if you were going to enter into that path, man, I can't imagine dealing with that sort of uncertainty around, will they survive the defrosting? Will they survive the transfer? Will they survive, the early days in the womb? I mean, I personally, there's no way I could have handled that kind of uncertainty. But of course, there's uncertainty in every path to parenthood, right?
Right.
Even the most perfect quote unquote paths to parenthood, is still a lot of uncertainty. So beware if you should desire to become a parent, because it will wreck you in every way,
That's
right?
true.
In beautiful ways, but it will cause you to grow and to stretch and to suffer. Let's be honest.
Mm-hmm. I think it was Mother Teresa, might be totally misquoting here, but I think she said there is no love without suffering.
Amen.
So whoever said it, that was great. That was a good one.
I think her word was either suffering or sacrifice, but I actually have a portrait of her with that quote under it. I can't remember if it's suffering or sacrifice, but yeah, it's and
Maybe it was sacrifice, but I don't know if
it's
there's a
true.
sacrifice without a little suffering.
Right. And that is what really this whole journey of becoming a parent. I really think, I laugh. I'm like, okay, Lord, like, dang, what did tricked me into wanting to be a mom. I didn't know that I was going to be, in such a crucible of suffering this whole time. I mean, that's really what it is. And that's how we grow into saints, is through suffering, one way or another. Whew.
Right. Well, is there anything else we haven't discussed that you would like to mention for our listeners?
Um, do people have a way to find a napro doctor?
Uh,
Just a couple of maybe ideas about where to find a napro doctor.
sure, yeah, I can put the links in the bottom
Yeah.
of the show notes.
mycatholicdoctor.com or org, is a virtual platform where one can see Creighton practitioners or NAPRO doctors. So the good news is that this kind of care is more and more available through virtual means,
Mm.
which is great. So just invite everyone who's out there who's just kind of interested, to reach out to find a NAPRO doctor and start charting. Yeah.
You did mention a little, throw one more in here. You did
Mm-hmm.
mention a little bit earlier that there are not as many as we might like to see. What would you say to somebody who's considering becoming a NAPRO caregiver, or maybe they're a medical student, or maybe it's a doctor who's already practicing an OBGYN and just
Mm-hmm.
conventional medicine? What would you
Mm-hmm.
say to either of those, if they're
Yes.
listening?
It's so rewarding, but it's not rewarding in the way that you might think. Right. So, the effort, is a lot more, right? There's a lot more work. There's a lot more time spent with patients. There's probably less money than you would normally make. I mean, it's really it's not simply a couple of extra tools in the toolbox. I mean, our medical system has become obsessed with this idea of efficiency, right? Which St. John Paul II said was one of the kind of roots of the culture of death.
Mm-hmm.
So anyone in healthcare right now is kind of infected, if you will, with this idea that to be a good doctor, nurse, whatever, is to be a productive, and to meet a quota and to see as many patients as possible and to be very busy and very exhausted. And I mean, and the rate of physician burnout and even suicide is rising. So it means to be an napro doctor and to be at the service of life in this way means to live very counterculturally. And you need a radical, I think, faith, because I've been laughed at by people who are, following the guidelines of their particular school or certification. What we can't, for example, seminal fluid analysis. The you know we ask patients to use a perforated condom to obtain specimen. Well, if you have a really good lab director, they will throw that specimen out. Okay, so things like that. So you have to be very, very intentional and know the why every day when you go to work. And the why cannot be so that I can make more money, and because that is simply not going to be enough to allow the sacrifice that's involved. So
in some ways, like, this is a way of practicing medicine that's more of a return to the older ways of practicing medicine, or even akin to like a ministry, because you really are treating a person. You're not a car mechanic that's just doing a list of interventions or replacing a certain part or putting a certain fluid in, and that car is going to react predictably. It's a biological organism and a human person, to that. So it's really beautiful what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And so I don't want to over like sell it like, oh yeah, it's so easy. Just go to the class and you're going to learn some new tools and you'll be able to help people be really good. No, it's crucifying. It's crucifying, but we know what comes after the cross, right? And that's why we do what we do. So yeah, and thank you for doing this and just sharing this message of hope and truth with so many people that need to hear it.
Yeah, thank you for being here. This has been a wonderful discussion. Really appreciate it. We will put all of your links, contacts, and those resources for doctors in the show notes. Anything else before we say our goodbyes?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Samantha.